I've put a disclaimer up there because the topic that I'm looking at, as you have seen the name, is entitled Ellen White and the Use of Medicine. And I've expanded it a bit to say a contextual review, because she has written so much on this subject that we must do it in context. And for that reason, I've had to look at a number of other publications. To that end, may I request that all those who are looking at this, please use this for the context that it is intended, for information and for education. Should you find the need to quote or to take any of these slides out, please keep them in their context so that we all have the same understanding. This is the outline of the presentation I'm going to be making. It's got 6 main points. It won't always come out specifically to say that. I invite you to look at them, and then we can flow together. We'll go into the introduction, we'll look at the prevailing scenery, what was the world like where Mrs. White was, and then we'll get to try to understand what was her perspective of health. And then we'll look at some of the issues on medicine, because we are talking about hair and medicine. And then finally, we will then come to the conclusion of that to say what really was her perspective in terms of the use of medicine. And I hope by the time we get to the end, we'll reach the same closing remarks. For me to look through this, I've just shared with you a whole string of books that I've had to review. And I have only 36 minutes right now. Therefore, obviously, I'm just going to touch very, very, very briefly on those books. But you are welcome to look at them and go and read them for yourself so that we can understand where we are together. Within this topic, one has to ask oneself a specific question. And the question I chose to deal with is, what does Mrs. White say about the use of drugs and other medical preparations and implements? I specifically separated them because I recognize that in our context, we often struggle with this thing of drugs and then herbs. So we will look at that. Do her statements permit or prohibit the use of medicinal drugs? And again, qualified medicinal, because I believe that as a church, we are clear on the issue of drugs that are recreational. So this has got to be again in context. Does she promote the use of herbs above all? Is that the understanding that we should have? And are her advices sound and relevant in the context of medicine today? Those are the questions that we are going to try to look at. Now, what was the situation like during the time that Mrs. White was writing? I want to put to you that there was little or no understanding of anatomy and physiology. There was little or no understanding of the theory of germs, that germs actually cause diseases. The human body, back then, they had a perception or a belief that the human body was made into various compartments that had fluids, and that we had 4 main fluids, which would be the blood, the phlegm, the green bile, and the yellow bile. And to that end, you'll notice that that's why most of the medication or the treatments that was being done was given to handle the fluids. So disease was believed to come about because of the imbalance in the fluids. That is why you'll have treatments that will bleed you, or they'll give you something to make you throw up, or they'll give you something, an enema, because all the time the belief was that your fluids have gone into imbalance. That was their understanding. Of course, there was a lot of mysticism around, which still is around today. And the other challenge was there were very few well-trained professionals in the field of medicine as we know it today. So that was the situation around which that she was writing. And just to take you very quickly through the history of the timelines when she was there, you will notice that, of course, 1844, as Adventists, we look at it on the Great Disappointments, but there was a lot of things that were happening on around in the world in 1844. Among other things, that was the time that the first ever dental school was being opened. And now, if you look at that, that should help you to appreciate where then was the field of dentistry, if it was only being opened there. That's when we started the public health movements, and that's when the first health board was established, which then would go to the issue of regulation, if you're only establishing the health board at that point in time. And this 1873 is a very interesting year because that was the year that one school of nursing decided to start implementing hygienic methods. That means up to that time, people were not implementing hygienic methods. Doctors would go from one patient to another without necessarily washing their hands, for instance. After all, they didn't know anything about germs. And in the world of medicine at large, it wasn't until 1862 that Louis Pasteur first discovered that there is something called germs and that they can spread disease. 1871, that's when we discover the leprosy bacillus, which means for the first time we begin to accept and acknowledge that leprosy was caused by a bacteria and it's not just a curse from somewhere. And I won't be going through all of them. You are looking at them there. We've got a number of things that were happening. And as a church in 1878, that's when we opened our first medical and surgical sanitarium. Then, over and above that, a lot of other developments come. But I want you to rush you to the end one day. You've got 1892, that's when the first virus was discovered, which means the writing of Mrs. White that you are finding before that time, the world of medicine itself was not alive to the presence of viruses. And 1897, that's when the first useful drug was manufactured. Now you've got to think, what then was being used before this, the first useful drug comes on the scene? And of course, you have got other firsts that come in, but I want you to go to 1928. That's when the first antibiotic was discovered, penicillin. And I'm saying discovered, not manufactured. That means we did not have antibiotics at that point. And this is in the context of what are we talking about when we say Mrs. White was talking about drugs. We need to understand that. For appreciation, there is this book that is still surviving. It is there in Harvard Museum. And it's one of the manuals of treatment. I just want to share with you a couple of the treatment regimens that existed in her time. Look at this one. If you had rheumatic fever, they will give venesection. Venesection necessarily means they will bleed you. Remember, I said the idea was the fluids were imbalanced. So the limbs are aching because the fluids are imbalanced, therefore you must be bled. And they will give you Colomel, and Colomel in this case, that's a mercury that you take, and they'll give you a lot of purgatives, something for you to have a running tummy or to throw up because your fluids are imbalanced. That's why you are having rheumatic fever. If you have diabetes, guess how we treated diabetes? They'll bleed you again. Remember, your problem is your fluids are imbalanced. So they'll bleed you, and then they'll give you all sorts of concoction. This is from the book, page 175. This was what the students were being taught. When somebody comes, and they would diagnose the disease correctly, yes, this is diabetes. Give her some mercury. Give her something like lead. Give her some zinc and some copper. It is only, It is only much later that we come to find out, 60 years later, we come to find out that food helps. This is what? 1868, the world of medicine. Mrs. White gets her vision in 1863. Now you should begin to see how God is intervening in the affairs of men, because this is what is happening around her. And if you have got gout, they will again give you all those other combinations there. But I want to rush to this one, bronchitis. If you've got a cold and you are coughing, you've got bronchitis, you will actually be given opium. That's what you'll be given. And then you'll be given some morphine at bedtime. We may laugh at this, but did you know that even our drugs today, a number of our cough mixtures still have got a morphine derivative? We call it codeine, but we don't think about much. But that is for you to understand the context of medicine and what was being given. I like this quotation that is taken from one of the medical historians. She says, on the state of medicine in America in the late 18 to 1900, there were no licensing requirements for medical personnel or professional oversight. In the face of declining respectability, physicians, anxious to re-establish their credentials, began to use more extreme depletion methods. The result was the proliferation of competing health initiatives and a growth of medical sectarian. And a number of things came into the United States, which Mrs. White now had to deal with, that were coming from other countries. I've listed there some of the remedies that in our territory in SID, we think they are new medicines, but these have always been around. Homeopathy, as you can see, come from Germany, and it actually started somewhere in 1796. It started to come in. So Mrs. White, when she was writing, homeopathy was there. Iridiology was there. It is coming from Hungary, but the idea with it comes all the way from 1660s. Ayurveda, the first recorded records that we have is from 400 AD. When they come this side and we talk about it, it's like Mrs. White cannot be talking about them because they were not there, but they were there. They started to come in, as you can see, the days that are there. Acupuncture, the first records of it, you have it from as far back as 100 BC. It's not a new science. They are not new things that we are dealing with. So, what then was her approach to health in view of the environment and the times that she lived in? One theme runs through all the writings of Mrs. White. Mrs. White looks at a human being as created perfect in the hands of God, and that a human being and God in his mercy has given us health. Our quest then is for restoration. Her whole writings, whether it is prophetic writings or it's about education, is always about the restoration of man to his original image, to be more like his maker. And he acknowledges that man was created perfect and sin came. Therefore, her attitude towards medicine is towards what we call preventive medicine. And it may look like a new science. She was so ahead of her time that it's only in the last 10 years that the WHO has got this thing, and we are all talking about preventive medicine. In your various countries, you will be hearing about preventive medicine. But that I want to present to you was actually her perspective in terms of medicine. Why do we say that? If you look at the book, Counsels to Parents and Teachers, page 83, she talks about the fact that children and youth, they're actually very healthy. They sit in classrooms the whole time, and if they are not allowed to go out to exercise, they will soon not be able to concentrate. If you read that statement out of context, as we were taught this morning that we have to read in context, you may think Mrs. White did not want us to send our children to school. But I want us to look at it from another perspective that says, she is saying children and youth are healthy. That's the starting point. That they need to be physically active as well as if they want to preserve their health, that there should be a balance. But more importantly, she starts from the children talking about prevention of diseases that we know today of inactivity, prevention of your cardiovascular diseases, prevention of other conditions. We look at this other quotation from a call to health ministry. She says, it is important that instructions should be given by ministers in regard to living temperately. They should show the relationship which eating, working, resting, and dressing sustain to health. Her perspective is not a treatment approach. Mrs. White's perspective is a prevention approach. Let's look at this one. She is totally in line with the Bible. She's saying, your body is the temple of God. Whatever you do, whatever you put into it, however you treat it, do it for the glory of God. And then I've supplied some emphasis here on the book, Counsels on Health. Now comes the issue that sometimes we have to face with. She talks about how people, it says, a practice that is laying the foundation of a vast amount of disease, and of even more serious is the free will use of poisonous drugs. Many of us, we read and we stop at the poisonous drugs and say, no, we can't use drugs. But look at what comes next. When attacked with disease, many will not take the trouble to search the cause of their illness. And then they've got anxiety, they want to be rid of the conditions, and they go on to take this drug and that drug, but with no thought of making a change of their healthful habits. Mrs. White's perspective is that we need to know the cause of the disease, and we need to prevent the disease. In the book, Counsels on Health, again, page 261, she says, drug medication, as it is generally practiced, is a curse. A lot of times we get that quotation, and that quotation is sometimes interpreted to mean, let's not use any drugs at all. But let's go to the next section. What does she say? Educate away from drugs. Use them less and less, and depend on what? Upon hygienic methods, which are pure air, pure water, proper exercise, and a clear conscience. Now look at the rest of the statement. Those who persist in the use of tea, coffee, flesh foods will feel the need for drugs, but many might recover without them. So again here, the perceptive and the viewpoint is, what is it that is causing you to go sick? Get rid of that, then you should not have the discussion about which drug to use or not to use. That is her, the point where she's starting from. So in view of how harmful the drugs are, as she is putting forward, and in all those other quotations that I've shown you before, should we perhaps bend and find refuge in the natural substances? The question would be, what are these natural substances? When she was talking about move away from drugs, what drugs did she actually quote that were there for her time? Remember, I've given you the background of what medication was there. Let's take this quotation here, Healthy Living, 247. It says, the use of tea, coffee, tobacco, opium, wine, beer, and other stimulants, they give nature a false support. You already can see the kinds of things that she's talking about. Now, let's go to one that is talking specifically as drugs in the context of treatment. This is a long story, and I would invite you to take the quotation. It's in the book Selected Messages, book 2, page 444, where she's talking about this poor family that had these conditions where 3 members of the family ended up dying. I've just taken excerpts where she's actually, after she has been shown this family that was dying from the various use of various drugs, she then makes those conclusions that you have just seen. Drugs are bad. She says here, the opium stupefied her. She slept and nothing could arouse her from the death-like stupor. And there's a lot of other paragraphs how she describes how she's suffering. And then it goes on. The physician's last resort was calomel. For some time, she seemed to be between life and death. And then she describes the pain of the family and everything. Then comes the third physician. Then she says, he gave her a powder from a vial upon which was written Nux vomica. She lingered a few years, a helpless, pitiful sufferer, and died in much agony. Oh, sorry, I didn't realize that wasn't there. Sorry about that. Okay, so this is the situation that Mrs. White is sitting with. She's seeing people dying from these so-called drugs. And from the history that I've given you before, that of course was true. Didn't we see that rheumatic fever will be treated with calomel and opium? According to the book that I've just shown you, which was the Encyclopedia of Medicine back then, it does specifically say that when somebody has rheumatic fever, you give venesection, you give calomel, you combine with purgatives, and then you give opium. Now, what are these things? As I've said, venesection is bleeding the person. Calomel is a mercury chloride, which is usually given to people and it will give you diarrhea. For the record, Ayurveda still uses that, and there are some of the other alternative medicines that still use it. Opium, as we all come to know it, is an illegal drug. Now, the things that she talks about coffee and tea. What is coffee? It's a bean from a plant, isn't it? She talks about tea. That's a herb. Those are leaves. She talks about tobacco. That's a picture of tobacco. What is tobacco? It's a plant. And these are the things that she's saying are causing us disease. She talks about opium. Opium is actually the juice from a poppy plant. That is opium. As you can see, the person on the right there, you just slice it, and then the juice comes out of it, and you make the latex. That is when you dry, and that's what people smoke. That's opium. And it is out of that that we then process it on to get your morphine and to get your other drugs. She talks about Nux vomica. Nux vomica is actually a plant. We have it also here in the Natal area. I think we call it Natal monkey fruits. That's what it looks like. We have got the less poisonous type, but the leaves are still poisonous. Out of it, we make strychnine. Strychnine is a severe poison. That's what people kill each other with. And that's Nux vomica. That's what people were using at that point. What is the point here? Sometimes we say Mrs. White was educating us away from drugs, but was putting us into herbs. If you look at it in context, all the drugs that are mentioned there are actually herbs. Therefore, there is call for wisdom. And I just want to say a few words about herbs. We cannot always assume that because these herbs are natural, that they are harmless. We can't. Nor can we just assume that they do not have medicinal value. So we have to meet in the middle. It is not true that herbs cannot cure you. Neither is it true that they can't kill you. So there's a study there that was done. It's an isolated study. I just wanted to share that, which shown that at that point, those that have been examined, they found that 20% of them did not have any medicinal value at all. They were probably just foods. 40% of them were hallucinogens, and 40% had some degree of medicine. Of course, you will question what were in that package, but it is used as an illustration. I want to share with you that a number of the drugs that you find in the hospital actually are the herbs. Some of you may have been given a heart medicine we call digoxin. Digoxin is a foxglove, and that is the plant. All that you do is you titrate from it and make it into a pill and you give it the person. It's got very strong effect on the heart. It doesn't matter whether you take the flower or you take the pill from the hospital. It still affects the heart the same way. Another drug that we know so much is aspirin. Aspirin is actually taken from the willow tree. You have the willow and sometimes the myrtle plants. Any plant that has got a lot of salicylate in it, we take that, we titrate it, and then crystallize, voila, we've got aspirin. So it is actually something coming from the herbs. But of course, the problem with the herbs is that we believe herbs are natural because we are using them directly. Isn't it? The drugs are processed. Now, I put it to you, how many of those who are using herbs take a plant and start chewing it off? By and large, we boil them to drink the juice. We dry them. We pick them into a powder. Is that not processing? That's how we get drugs. We dry them, we put them into a powder, we put there, and then voila, you've got the drug. Therefore, when we are talking about this, let's understand and appreciate that these things are in the same basket. Just a quick summary there of what happens with the herbal versus pharmaceutical medicine. If you look at that quickly, you'll notice it's the same thing. Both of them have got medicinal value. Many of them, they're mixed. You don't get somebody giving you just one herb, neither do you get just one drug. They're often mixed and they will interrelate. All of them are eliminated from the body through the same organs. They come out either through the lungs, through the liver, or through the kidneys. So they will do their damage on the way as they do that. But there is one major difference. Currently, herbs are not highly regulated. In the era of herbs, because of the perceptions and beliefs we have, we are back to the time where Mrs. White was, where medicine was not well regulated. But pharmaceutical, on the other hand, are highly regulated. So highly regulated that we can even use some of the laws from how far back. You can see, at least in America, in 1962, we had the first Food Drug Administration that was requiring that there should be efficacy provided in prescription drugs. This is important because this is years after the death of Mrs. White, years after she had been around and writing. That's when the medical world woke up to say, drugs are not safe. Make the drugs safe. Therefore, this calls for knowledge and intense study. It will therefore be incorrect to say Mrs. White allowed the use of herbs and prohibited the use of drugs, as I've just demonstrated. But it will be also even much better to actually let her speak for herself. Selected Messages, Book 2, it says, she was writing to somebody there, the idea which you hold that no remedies should be used for the sick is an error. God does not heal the sick without the aid of the means of healing which lie within the reach of man. So God actually has given us these things for us to use. But he has put something in place for us to how to use them. Medical ministry, page 221, it says the first labors of a physician should be to educate the sick and suffering in the very cause they should pursue to prevent disease. Because treatment is a big problem, and there's the rest of that. My time is running out. I've given you the page there. She also now puts into place what she is advocating. Pure air, sunlight, abstemiousness, rest, exercise, proper diet, the use of water, trust in divine power. These are the true remedies. And it says there, it is essential both to understand the principles involved in treatment of the sick and to have a practical training that will enable one rightly to use this knowledge. That's what Mrs. White's position on medicine is. That first we must prevent the disease, and then we must learn to understand how to use those things that are in our place. And if you are going to go out to treat somebody, you must have knowledge on that. She goes on to give us a big warning in the book Spiritual Gifts, Volume 4a. God's servants should not administer medicines which they know will leave behind injurious effects upon the system, even if they do relieve present suffering. Position of her on medicine, don't give anything that is going to harm somebody. Every poisonous preparation in the vegetable and mineral kingdom taken into the system will leave its wretched influence affecting the liver and the lungs and deranging the systems generally. As a doctor, I truly appreciate this statement because, as I've said before, she lived in an era where anatomy was not well known. But look at how she's actually putting the things that, if you look at the pharmaceutical books for today, it took us some years to get to understand the elimination of drugs. But she already knew back then that the drugs that you take in are going to hurt your lungs. And that's the place how drugs are eliminated. When you take something in, it will come out either through the lungs or it will come out through the liver. That's a detoxifying organ. Or it will come out through the kidney. And definitely it will go on to affect other parts of the body. So she truly was inspired, and she truly was ahead of her time, considering that she was not a medical person, she was not trained. Remember, I showed you when the schools started, when the schools were opened. So she was not even a student of any of those schools. But she said some things that at that time was not even known by the people in the field of medicine. It's many years later that we found out. I showed you that X-ray came only close to 1900. So people had not even seen the lungs and the other things, but she was talking about them. So it is very, very powerful that she had those statements there. And then she goes on to say, the distinction between prevention and cure has not been made sufficiently important. Teach the people that it is better to know how to keep well than how to cure disease. A similar statement like this was taken up by United Nations and WHO somewhere in the mid-80s when we started to really push hard for preventative medicine, because everybody recognizes that to try to cure people, to try to treat, we have side effects to deal with. We can't even afford it. It's better to prevent. She wrote about it in 1902, prevention. Our physicians should be wise educators, warning all against self-indulgence, showing that abstinence from the things that God has prohibited is the only way to prevent ruin of the body and mind. She goes on to say, in the book Counsels to Parents, Teachers, and Students, God is the author of science. Scientific research opens to the mind vast fields of thoughts and information, enabling us to see God in his created works. And also, in the Science of the Times, May 26 of 1890, she wrote, much has been lost because our ministers and people have concluded that we have had all the truth essential for us as a people. But such a conclusion is erroneous and in harmony with the deceptions of Satan. For truth will constantly unfold. Somewhere in one of her books, she says, truth comes out like a plant. First the blade, and then the shoot, and then ultimately you've got the full corn. In other words, as we were told this morning, she wrote in the context of what was available then. At the time she wrote, truly, drugs were poison. And we have just demonstrated that those drugs that were being used there, even the medical world accepts that they were poison. But since then, as she has cautioned, a lot of science has come through. A lot of things, regulatory systems have come in place. It will then not be perhaps so wise for one to try to take that, what she wrote at that time and say, even as we speak right now, all drugs are poison. But there are some things. What happened to my slide? Okay. Why are we streaming to the rest of the world? Okay. I've lost my slide in there, somewhere within the projections. However, what I wanted to bring forward is that she is very, very clear to show us that the signs that of the times that we live in, at the time that she lived in, those were the things that were wrong. But we learned this morning about the principle. The principle of it is still true. The principle of first, do no harm. The principle of prevention, keep your body healthy. The principle of drugs have side effects. They will damage the body. It doesn't matter how good they are. The medical people will admit it, the first people to admit it to you. When they give you the drugs, that these drugs will have side effects, take them this way. Anything that you take will have an impact in your body. And therefore, the position is, as has been stated, prevention, prevention. If those slides up there could catch up with me, I would love us to get to the conclusion of the matter. We should be the last slide you are having. I'm not even sure if this thing is working anymore here. Okay, help me to get to the conclusion there. In conclusion to the question that has been put forward, what then is Mrs. White's position in relation to medicine? The first conclusion I would like to make is Mrs. White was emphatic on disease prevention as the best approach to health preservation. If anybody wants to go out there and talk about what Mrs. White is saying about medicine, it's not an argument between drugs or no drugs, between vaccines or no vaccines. It's a fundamental prevention. Dispense of all that is evil, dispense of all that is causing the disease. Start using the natural remedies, use water, exercise, all those things judiciously. Then you are in line with what Mrs. White was talking about. And then, thank you, this prevention will prioritize knowledge. It's important that she actually puts that throughout her thread. Knowledge is important because too much water is also not good for you. Too much exercise, there is such a thing as too much exercise. Too much sunshine, we know it will give you cancer. So yes, knowledge, she said they should be judiciously used. We should see that context and know that it is actually intentional. And then she says, okay, the other statement we are concluding, point number 2, all her statements and precautions on the liberal and ignorant use of medicine, be it pharmaceutical or herbs, were true at her time, and they're still true today. She talked about the danger of your nux vomica. She didn't know much about the science that goes into it. Today, we know that we use that in chemistry and other places to create poison. Your rat poison, that's the thing that is in rat poison. Try taking rat poison and you'll know she was telling the truth back then. It is true even now. She talked about opium. At the time that she wrote about opium, it was a liberal thing. It wasn't until about 20 years later that legislation was written around opium. There were opium cafes. If you look at the time that she was writing, you find that the opium cafeterias, it was smoked as freely as tobacco was smoked in your time before the laws against tobacco came in. You know how much we had to fight to get tobacco out of the streets. In the same manner, they had to fight opium. But more than that, opium was prescribing for children. There were medicines that you put on the gum for children who are teething. You put a bit of opium here so that they don't bleed so much. It was true back then that opium is a poison. It is true today. It was true back then that caution had to be taken when you are using drugs and herbs. Remember the thing with opium and them, they are actually herbs. It was true about that precaution back then. It is still true today. And she was way ahead of her time, as I've shown you the timelines, even in medical science itself. The last conclusion I would like to make is, she states that, she doesn't state, but she teaches that in the event of disease occurring, one should use knowledgeably and judiciously remedies that will have the least side effects on the patient. We know that because when there was a smallpox outbreak, she was vaccinated. We have those records that she was. We know that because she states that after Loma Linda put in an X-ray machine, she went and had herself X-rayed. Those were the things that were available. Many of the things we are asking about were not there during her time. Therefore, she has not written explicitly about it. And it is no more different than from the explicit writing of the Bible pertaining certain medicine. Bible does not tell you whether a stethoscope is a good thing to be used or not because it wasn't discovered at that time. But the Bible will tell you about the fig poultice because the figs were there at that time. Mrs. White too talks about the things that were there at that time, but her principles transcend that time to our time. They are still true. And then, lastly, she says, the cause of disease must be identified and eliminated. Our challenge often is we don't actually want to deal with the cause of disease. If the cause of disease is dietary, instead of me dealing with the diet, I do exactly what she has said we do. I don't leave the diet that is causing me the problem. I want to take the drug. Then I have the side effects from the drug, and then I come back and there's a big issue on that. If we can then take her precaution in the context and the spirit that was being given, first, do no harm. That is her position. Your body is able to fight if you will keep it in the state that you are meant to keep it in. Prevention. May God bless us.